Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
It is not an unintended consequence of an Environmental Protection Act that sometimes we might protect the environment.
How did that happen?
Right? Like, let's be crystal clear here that the reason these laws exist is that even John Howard could see that sometimes industry would want to do a thing that would lead to catastrophic environmental harm, like a species extinction.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. And as we record this, the government is intending to gut Australia's environment protection laws with the help of the Coalition.
That will be one of the most egregious acts of environmental vandalism this Parliament has ever been responsible for.
The changes remove the ability to revoke approvals in certain circumstances.
This is not about activists versus fish farmers. This is about our democracy.
Their proposed changes come at the behest of the salmon industry, which wants to continue its destructive operations in Tasmania, that's driving the endangered Maugean skate towards the brink of extinction.
We live with the impacts of this industry every day. They are right on the doorsteps of our homes. They are polluting our beaches.
It's not a lot to ask for multinationals that have been down there 3 years, they've paid no tax, and in the meantime, your taxpayers' money is spending $37 million because we don't have a problem in Macquarie Harbour. Listen to this, apparently, according to the PM, we don't have a problem, but we're spending $37 million of your money over the next 12 months to put oxygen into it.
But the impacts of these changes to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, or the EPBC Act, wouldn't end there. The amendments seek to limit third-party civil society organisations from challenging past government approvals of projects. It's anti-democratic, anti-science, and it could have major implications for Australia's climate and environment that stretch well beyond Tasmania. The bill will be introduced today, Budget Day, and it could be passed by the Parliament within the next 24 hours. Joining me to unpack this unprecedented attack on Australia's environment laws is Dr. Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, and Leanne Minshull, our Strategy Director. G'day, Richard. G'day, Leanne. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Eb.
Hi, Eb.
Richard, I just want to start with kind of how fast this is moving. It's going to be introduced into the Parliament today, but we didn't even really see this legislation until yesterday. The first kind of draft got circulated. Is that right?
Oh, that's right. And, this is, to be clear, this is John Howard's old environmental laws. They've been around for decades. We're 3 years into the Albanese government's term. This is the last days of Parliament for this term. And this captain's pick to rescue the salmon industry has happened so fast that, yes, the politicians didn't get to see the legislation until Monday. We didn't get to see the legislation until Monday. Here we are Tuesday. It's before the House. To say this is policy on the run would be to treat it kindly. This is policy at warp speed. And again, this is John Howard's environment laws. The idea that we haven't had time to figure out if they work or not How ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that the Prime Minister 10 years ago wanted to fix John Howard's environment laws, but he wanted it to be done in a manner that was considered and fix them properly.
The idea that we should simply trust this government to protect Australia's natural environment, free from judicial review, would be laughable if it was not so very serious. But Labor doesn't just oppose this legislation because of this government's appalling record on the environment. We do so as a matter of principle. The right of citizens withstanding to challenge their governments in court is a fundamental pillar of a robust democracy. We must not set this principle aside simply to provide a drowning Prime Minister with a headline and a stash.
And you fast forward 10 years, he wants to fix them by making them worse and doing it really quickly.
Yeah. So when we say quickly, Richard, these could pass within the next 24 hours. They're introduced today and could, if they get coalition support, pass the Senate tomorrow. Is that right?
Absolutely. So to be clear, the only way these laws will pass is if both the Labor Party and the coalition vote together, not just on these bills, but Labor and the coalition would have to vote together on what's called a guillotine motion, which would be a procedural motion to silence debate, to silence analysis within the parliament itself. So to rush this legislation through, legislation that was literally only seen by people yesterday, the government is banking on the fact that the Liberals will say, sure, why would you want an inquiry into these changes to John Howard's laws? Who cares about the legal advice that says these new amendments might make things worse, not better? To get it through this week, when there's a bit else going on with the budget, to get it through this week would require the coalition and Labor to vote to rush it through and then to show up and vote for this watering down of Howard's environment laws. Howard went too far, right? Let's own this. That greenie John Howard went too far, and we need Anthony Albanese to come and to fix it.
Leanne, I was talking to Eloise Carr last week about the impacts in particular on the Maugean skate and why this has all come about, essentially, is trying to protect the skate. And this legislation has been introduced by the Prime Minister really at the behest of the salmon industry. Can you just talk us through the politics of how we've arrived at this point where the Prime Minister is introducing legislation, the behest of one industry?
Sure, and I think it's good to note too that the little skates survived an ice age and all sorts of, physical onslaughts, and it just would be ironic and really sad if it doesn't survive an amendment to the EPBC Act that, as you said, has come about because the salmon industry is so bad and is operating so poorly that we've got in other parts of Tasmania dead, rotting pieces of fish and fat globules washing up on the pristine beaches. And one of the best things Tasmania's got going for it is its clean, green image. I used to live there. It's a beautiful place to live. I used to run a tourism operation there. It's a great place for tourists to come. This is doing it no favours. But for whatever reason, I think both internal ALP politics, but then more broadly the ALP and the Prime Minister signalling not just to the fish companies but to the extractivist industry at large that you are important to us. We will do literally whatever it takes to make sure that you are okay and you can keep going. So I think there's internal ALP politics where there's a lot of people in the ALP that are, behind the salmon industry itself and possibly believe their own rhetoric around that we need to protect jobs, even though there's less than 40 jobs actually in Macquarie Harbour. Then there's the external signalling, which is just as important politically to other industries like the gas industry, the coal industry, that don't worry about it. It doesn't matter how bad things get environmentally. It doesn't matter how much the community pushes back. We're going to put your interests at number one.
Just as these laws look set to do the thing that they're meant to do and protect World Heritage and protect the skate, they're going to change the law.
The scope of these laws is far, far
broader than just limited to salmon farming or just limited to Macquarie Harbour. As long as the criteria are met, any and all projects fall within the scope of these laws.
But this isn't just about the skate. This is an attack on democracy.
And Leanne, obviously we think this is a big threat to the rest of the environment movement, that as you've mentioned, this is just kind of the thin end of the wedge and it's a signal to lots of other industries. The Australia Institute published an open letter that appeared in several newspapers today, the day the legislation was introduced, co-signed by about 50 environment organisations. What are the implications for other organisations that are working to protect biodiversity or, ecosystems?
Well, there's two things there. There's the impact on, if the amendment goes through, how will that affect other projects? So there's a lot of debate over how far the amendments could stretch. Labor is obviously arguing that it's very narrowly defined and that it will only be for Macquarie Harbour. That's completely not right, because if you were going to make this just about Macquarie Harbour, it's simple, just put Macquarie Harbour in the amendment itself. So it is open for this to stray into other areas and other projects. And something interesting that we found out, that we have to go back and triple check this, but it appears that of all the projects that have been asked to be reconsidered, there's only one or two, Australia Institute and Bob Brown Foundation, could possibly be the first time that this particular amendment's been used, and it's usually used by ministers themselves. And you'd have to think that they were asking for review to make it easier for the companies rather than better for the environment, but who knows, we haven't looked into it. So yes, the amendment will have potentially bad effects for other projects and for the environment generally. And then for the environment movement itself, it's actually been a little bit of a rallying point. So I've been working in and around environmental groups for decades. I've not seen the environment movement so outraged. Everybody agrees that this is a really bad amendment, and everyone's really disappointed because a lot of environment groups thought that they'd actually get better environmental laws during this session of Parliament. Not only were they not delivered those better nature laws, they've been delivered a kick in the guts right at the 11th hour, just as we're about to go into another election.
And Richard, talking about the fact that actually third parties haven't really used the EPBC in the way that the Australia Institute successfully has over the past couple of years. So obviously we wrote to the Environment Minister with new evidence about the impact of salmon farming on this endangered species that kickstarted it, triggered a review. That's one of the things that this legislation is trying to stop. And Leanne's just pointed out it's actually not something that's happening that often. It's something that ministers, as Leanne said, have been using themselves. Is there any other purpose other than shutting out the environment movement to this kind of an amendment?
Look, this is ridiculous. Like, more than 25 years ago, the Howard government developed these laws. They have these specific provisions in the laws so that if something's been approved, but then things change, then you can reconsider whether the approval was a good idea. That was a good idea. Thanks, John Howard. That was a good idea. And who can ask for a reconsideration? A minister can, the industry themselves can, or the affected party themselves can, or a third party like the Australia Institute or the Bob Brown Foundation or another organisation. And as Leanne said, it's very, very rare. This is possibly the only time in the last 10 years, maybe it's one of the only times, that a third party, in this instance the Australia Institute and the Bob Brown Foundation, wrote and said, you know how you approved these salmon farms, you know how you said they'd be fine? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons to think they're not going to be fine. The water's warming, the salmon aren't as healthy as they used to be, the oxygen levels in the water near the Maugean skate, they're actually getting low. The skate's getting critically endangered. That's what the science says. So we wrote and said, hey, could you reconsider this decision? How radical? Could you reconsider it? And then we heard nothing, just crickets for 2 years. The Act says that if someone asks for a reconsideration, then the minister should act as soon as is practicable. So we did that back in 2023, and then we've had crickets for years until last week. An FOI request showed that the department back in 2023 said, this is a legit request. There is good science behind the request to reconsider. And the Act says you should do it as soon as practicable, Tanya Plibersek. So we reckon get your skates on, pardon the pun, and get on with it back in December 2023. So back in December 2023, Tanya Plibersek's department was saying, you have to reconsider this. This is important, and here's how to do it. And nothing's happened, except that when the FOI came out last week showing that the minister should do something, it's like, oh, sirens, alarm bells, quick, can we draft an amendment so that we don't have to do what the law says? So it's pretty clear that the only reason to do this is that for whatever reason, Tanya Plibersek really either doesn't want to do what the law says or the Prime Minister doesn't like what her answer will be. So either way, John Howard's environment laws that said this was a good process, we've followed that process. And then for one of the first times it's ever been used, it's like, oh, this is crazy. You can't expect us to do this. No, it was actually anticipated that someone would need to do this. And one of the first times it's been used, it's getting cut off.
Leanne, the salmon industry isn't the first to get a carve-out. Native forest logging is already kind of exempt under regional forest agreements. So what does Australia really need to protect our environment? How do we need to strengthen our laws?
Oh, good question, Ebony. And I think the first thing is, one thing that I do like about the EPBC that they're trying to get rid of, as Richard just said, you need the opportunity. We all need the opportunity to go back and change decisions that we've made in a climate that's changing. If ever there was a time in history where we need to be adapting and changing the way that we operate, it's now, when climate change is having an impact daily on the way that our physical environment is existing. So that's the first thing. I think that we need strong laws that have more democratic avenues for people when they see things happening in their own environment. When science tells us that there's something new occurring, we have to actually speed up and widen and deepen the way in which we can all engage with protecting our natural environment. We need to ensure that we keep the precautionary principle. So the precautionary principle's been around for decades, and that just says if you think something bad is going to happen, then stop doing what you're doing until you make sure it's not going to happen. So, we do that in our normal life. We don't, if we think that the brakes are dodgy on our car, we don't keep driving until we work out if they are or not. What we do is we don't drive the car and we get the brakes tested. But then for some reason, the precautionary principle's really been eroded over the past couple of decades because we think, no, we have to keep that industry or that activity going while we check to see if it is in fact having a bad impact. And the fragility of our ecosystems currently demands more of the precautionary principle, not less. I hadn't even thought about this, Ebony, but now you've asked me. Oh, geez, I've got a plan. And then the last arm is looking at how do we enforce that? Because, industry is really bad at regulating themselves. We've seen numerous times where that's happened. We regulate everything else really well. We really regulate the way that people get their welfare payments. We regulate people wearing their seatbelts, but for some reason, when it's a big thing like industry, we just say, no, you'll be able to keep an eye on yourself and make sure that you're doing the right thing. That's not good enough. So we do need a really strong environmental protection agency. It needs power, it needs teeth, it has to be transparent. But if that's all we get, which is what Labor has put on the table a few times over this term, we haven't even got that, but having a cop on the beat, just making sure that everybody's following really weak and bad laws makes no sense at all.
Let me go further, Eb. It is not an unintended consequence of an Environmental Protection Act that sometimes we might protect the environment.
How did that happen?
Right? Let's be crystal clear here that the reason these laws exist is that even John Howard could see that sometimes industry would want to do a thing that would lead to catastrophic environmental harm, like a species extinction of a species that has been with us since dinosaur times. It's lived through ice ages. It's been around for millions of years. Even John Howard could see that there'd be a point where a fish farm wanting to sell a few extra fish might get in the way of a species continuing its entire existence. And Albo's like, oh, hold on, hang on. You know, whoever foresaw a moment where this might be a problem. So to be clear, what is the point of having environmental protection legislation if when the legislation says this is a bad place to have a fish farm, it might have been okay in the past, but clearly it's no longer a good place? What is the point of having environmental protection laws that get overruled when for the first time someone's like, you know, that might be bad, right? Oh yeah, well, we better amend those laws. I mean, this is through the looking glass.
I want to go one further than Richard now. He's gone much further than me.
Oh, fine.
Well, because up until now, a lot of it was impacts on the environment. But in this case, if you look at the broader salmon industry across Tasmania, there's real questions being raised about are deceased fish making their way into the supermarkets that have elevated levels of antibiotics? And were they infected with the virus before they were packed into the freezers that people are going to and pulling out their healthy dinner? Now, we don't know that, okay? We can't sit here and say, yes, they absolutely are, but no, nor can anybody say they're absolutely not. So this is a time where there's a potential direct health or at least consumer awareness impact attached to the industry.
And I guess back to Richard's point, I mean, this is, as we've said, it's an endangered species that's known for its World Heritage value, that lives in a place that's partly the World Heritage wilderness area of Tasmania. If our environment laws can't protect this endangered species in a friggin' World Heritage area, like, what are we all doing here?
Yeah, well, look, I agree, but it's kind of worse than that. So on the one hand, we can't, this is the only place in the world the Morgan skate lives, right? This is it. It only lives in one place. There's only one place left in the world that you can find it. And we've got a Prime Minister that says, well, if it's a choice between the salmon farm and the continued existence of that whole species, he's on the salmon side. Like, this is wild. But it's worse than that. Because to be clear, the salmon industry is small. It's small in Tasmania. It's tiny in Australia. This is only a small part of the salmon industry, so it's a tiny bit of a tiny bit. As Leanne said, 40, 60 jobs for a species. But if the salmon industry can push labour around this easily, if the salmon industry can get a carve-out, sorry, I'm now picturing carving the rotting fish, but if the salmon industry can get a carve-out to protect, 40 jobs in a part of Tasmania, well, imagine what the gas industry are thinking. They might not be salivating about eating the salmon, but I bet they're salivating about getting their hands onto some new amendments that say, oh, but, if building a coal mine or a gas well over here is going to cause some inconvenience for, I don't know, another endangered species, we'll have to prioritise them. So, yeah, it's an appalling environmental outcome. But if the salmon industry can push the Albanese government around this much, imagine how much these laws are going to get gutted when the gas industry takes a long run up at it.
Senator Dunniam was on the radio this morning saying that we can't blame the salmon industry for killing the Morgan skate because it actually did used to live in Bathurst Harbour and it died there and there was no salmon industry. So, okay.
Oh, fair's fair. Fair's fair. It's just not a very resilient fish.
Yeah.
Maybe the problem with endangered species is we don't have enough of them, Leanne. Well, I think we probably need to wrap it up there because I know this is fast moving and you guys got to get up to Parliament and do what we can to see if we can change the outcome of this legislation to actually protect the skate, which is why we started this research in the first place. So thanks very much for joining us. I know you're both very busy and yeah, we'll see how this goes, I guess, within the next 24 hours.
Thanks, Eb. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Eb. Thanks, Leanne.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 25th of March, and things may have changed since recording. In fact, they almost certainly have. You can sign our petition calling on the government not to gut Australia's environment laws by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or find the link in the show notes. We would love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute with an AUS on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.